welcome everybody to, this is the 19th event in our series of AAD sessions, which combines our core seminars with a sub series called AAD Books and other events that come out of the research centres Cube and Creature at London Metropolitan University. I'm making this introduction on behalf of London Metropolitan University and particularly the Centre for Urban and Built Ecologies, Cube, and we're delighted to be handing over this session to the stewardship of Ambrose Gillick to tell us about generosity in architecture. Ambrose Gillick is M.Arch course leader at Kent School of Architecture and Planning, and he leads transdisciplinary research on home, health, play, and food poverty with community groups and colleagues across the Channel region. Ambrose Gillick is writing a book on postmodern urban history for Lunt Humphreys and hosts the A is for Architecture podcast. The proceedings will be finishing at about 7 o'clock today, and Ambrose will steer us through presentations from the book's editors and conference organizers, Mary McVicker, Stephen Kite, and Charles Straczynski, and thereafter Sean Moxon and Jane Plossick, both of London Metropolitan, will speak about their chapters. So over to you, Ambrose, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you everybody for having me here, and to Jane Plossick for inviting me. I'm really pleased to get to re-engage with this conference, because I presented a paper at this conference in 2018, just before I came down to Kent from the Glasgow School of Art, and it was a very memorable conference. For a start, it was well attended, which is kind of rare for architecture conferences in my experience. So it was really lovely, and I'm glad that it's now come out in this book as well. Before I introduce the speakers, Mary, Stephen and Charles, I thought I might just speak a little bit about this issue around generosity, because in running this podcast that I've been doing over the last year and a half, and in working with the kind of work that I do down here in Kent, which is a rather extraordinary kind of urban and rural setting, the issue around generosity remains extremely strong. So it was perhaps a prescient conference topic, and it's a timely book, I think. And so as was said before, it's a very elegant book as well. It's nicely presented, and it obviously contains a lot of really good research, really good essays, but it also looks good, and that's kind of nice, because architecture books should look good, I think. But this issue of generosity is really fascinating, because obviously two main ways we use generous are the ideas around being kind or being generous, or there's the other side about being plentiful and being a large, generous portion of food. So it's got these kind of two sides to it, but it's about abundance. And I think that's really interesting in relation to our time, our moment. When I went and gave a paper, the paper I gave was called Just Architecture, or Just Architecture. Like The Guardian, I like to do a play on words on these things. But the idea behind it was that we're confronted by what the extraordinary writer Marian Robinson calls a kind of philosophy of austerity. I think when we get a little bit blindsided by the idea of austerity as a techno-economic system, Marian Robinson, who wrote the extraordinary novels Home and Gilead and so on, talks about it as a philosophy, as an epochal philosophy. And so generosity flies in the face of this. We are living in austere times. A lot of the way that we think about and engage with the world is through the paradigm of austerity, which is to do with the opposite of kindness, the opposite of generosity, and the opposite of plentifulness. And obviously, this continues to come at us through restrictive government. Behind me, and this is a really good segue, I have a model of Robin Hood Gardens made by one of my master's students, which is going to go into the V&A. And it's a model that kind of characterizes and analyzes Robin Hood Gardens at the moment it was demolished, because he wanted to try and understand it. But this comes from an epoch of generosity. This comes from a time when social housing and the common good were centralized, perhaps in the case of Robin Hood's Gardens, in a slightly inept fashion, arguably a totally inept fashion. 75% of the people who lived in Robin Hood's garden actually wanted to have it knocked down, which is amazing when you think about it. But the idea behind it, this idea of a generosity of architecture, of a giving architecture, of an architecture of civic care, is really, really something that is of extreme importance to our age. So that's kind of why I'm really chuffed and pleased to be asked. But I would say this also, that this idea of generosity also has within it the idea that there is a lack of generosity there. So the word itself, I think, contains, particularly for us academics and practitioners, it contains its own inverse, that generosity seems to imply or connote that there is a challenge, that there is a requisite resilience. And I think that's problematic, and that's what we're trying to deal with as architects, as architectural educators and academics, that we're trying to work out the logics for dealing with these hugely challenging conditions: social, economic, environmental, ecological, cultural, human, psychological conditions, and so on and so forth. So that's how I understand the context. That's why I'm glad to be here. But I've got 5 minutes to introduce the guests, the main speakers and the editors of Generosity in Architecture. Professor Mary McVicker, Professor Stephen Kite, Emeritus Professor Stephen Kite, and Dr. Charles Drzezinski. And as I was saying beforehand, I'm probably sat very close to Charles's office. I took over his course, so and I still teach it, but with a few amendments, because that was a long time ago. And lots of things have happened since then. But to start with, Mary McVicker. Mary is a professor, and by the way, Mary, please excuse me if I don't pronounce your very elegant name quite correctly. It's complicated.
It's close. It's Mary, but very close.
Sorry, Mary McVicker. She's professor of architecture at the Welsh School of Architecture at Cardiff University. And she leads Cardiff University's partnership platform Community Gateway. As well as this book, Generosity in Architecture, Mary's publications include Precision in Architecture, Certainty, Ambiguity and Deviation, which was published with Routledge in 2019, and Economy in Architecture, which she edited with Odgers and Stephen Kite as well in 2015. Mary has researched around co-production and live teaching with Community Gateway, work that has been published in Architectural Design, in Charette, and Architecture and Culture, and is supported by a £2 million redevelopment of the community-managed Grange Pavilion with Benham Architects and IBI Group, which is prize-winning, won the RSAW Design Awards, and was the RSAW Client of the Year Awards in 2022. So that's Mary, an eminent scholar and an eminent practitioner as well, and someone intimately involved in the interface between academia and activist roles within real life, as I like to call it. Stephen Kite, second editor of the book, is an emeritus professor at the Welsh School of Architecture as well at Cardiff University. And his research explores the history and theory of architecture and its wider links to visual culture. Stephen has published a lot and include monographs, Shadow Makers, A Cultural History of Shadows in Architecture in 2017, and Building Ruskin's Italy, Watching Architecture in 2012. And recently he published Shaping the Surface, Materiality and the History of British Architecture, 1840 to 2000, published with Bloomsbury at the end in December 2022. And obviously Generosity in Architecture with Routledge this last year as well. And Charles Drzezinski, our last editor of the book for this first section, is a Doctor of Architecture and Senior Lecturer at the University of the West of England. Charles's research interests include the intersections of architecture and post-linguistic schools of thought, in particular those put forward by Deleuze and Guattari, with a focus on the significance of subversion, as well as new or unconventional ideas in spatial design. So, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, that is our three speakers to begin our session this evening. And without further ado, and I think I'm on time and to budget, I'm going to hand over to Mary McVicker, Stephen Kite, and Charles Dzerzhinsky to carry on their introduction. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in before you do that, just to say that I forgot to mention, which I'm supposed to do at the beginning of this session, that this session is being recorded. And so if you do not want to appear on the recording, which will be shared on YouTube afterwards, please do mute yourself and close your image. But otherwise, that's all from me, and over to the speakers.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm just going to check that everyone can see this okay. Is that all right?
That's it. Yeah, we see it.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. We're really pleased to be celebrating the publication of Generosity and Architecture, and this is actually the first time we've publicly celebrated it. We haven't managed to get together for a proper celebration yet, and I think even in person with Stephen and Charles, we're still due a celebratory drink at some point. So this is a really lovely opportunity to celebrate together, and thank you so much to Jane, Shannon, Matthew, and Ambrose for setting this up. So as Ambrose mentioned, I'm Mary McVicker, and joining you with Stephen Kite and Charles as co-editors of Generosity and Architecture and of the conference itself. So Generosity and Architecture is the fourth in a series of edited books that we've published with Routledge, and we've really enjoyed working with Routledge through this. And these have all emerged from conferences which we've held at the Welsh School of Architecture, which originally began with Primitive, Original Matters in Architecture with Juliet Odgers, Flora Samuel and Adam Shar, and then continued with Quality, Out of Control with Alison Dutoit, Juliet Odgers and Adam Shar, and then went on to Economy in Architecture with Juliet Odgers, myself and Stephen, and most recently Generosity in Architecture. And this is also serving as a prompt that we probably should start thinking about the next book in the series and the next letter on a cover. Each of the conferences and the edited books invited contributions on themes that we felt were both specific and general, and which could be interpreted through the daily pragmatics of architectural practice, as well as from theoretical and political perspectives, and all of which aligned to the Welsh School of Architecture's emphasis on what we call grounded creativity. So the idea of supporting speculative and provocative work, but expecting that those speculations and provocations be aligned to real-world concerns. And Generosity in Architecture first emerged as a conference theme in 2017, following a conversation with Juliet Odgers and Zoe Berman, who at the time were running an undergraduate studio at WSA titled Generosity. A long conversation on a study tour, and this is the kind of conversation that we can never have as academics on a daily basis because you never have time to talk to each other. But the study tour kind of gave us the generosity of space and beautiful surroundings to lead to a longer conversation about what generosity meant. We questioned how architecture as a built form can variously offer and deny generosity, while architectural practitioners themselves may choose to offer, be expected to offer, or be demanded to offer generosity in their daily practice. So a subsequent conference call invited academics and practitioners, and we were really keen for the conference to include both, to question architecture's potential for generosity, to explore ways in which architecture aspires to or may be expected to give more than is necessary. And I think this concept of giving more than is necessary became a really central theme. And we suggested that contributions could be from a conceptual or a theoretical position, embedded in everyday processes and expectations of practice, or from considerations of procurement, regulation, and policy. So in July 2018, 70 international delegates joined us in Cardiff on an exceptionally hot week. I think it's the only time we've ever had people complain about the building being too hot. And we had 3 days, and really enjoyable days of presentations, workshops, and walks around Cardiff, presenting academic and practice-led research on interpretations of generosity. Contributions addressed constructed architecture from urban to detailed scales, gave critiques of generosity in architecture as a form of care, philanthropy, and charity, and shared accounts of generosity in the practice of architecture through co-production, practice, and labour. So our subsequent call for a publication of selected papers began by acknowledging the ambiguity of generosity, associated as much with lack as with excess, as Ambrose has already pointed out, and lying between need, expression, and means, both abundant and giving. Everywhere meanness surrounds us, even when wealth is obviously available, we observe in the introduction. So the chapters in architecture and in generosity in architecture present cases of scarcity and abundance, of consumption and waste, noble and ignoble sacrifice, and interpretations of poverty and wealth. The published book as it emerged was structured by 3 themes which came out of conversations at the conference: humanity and delight, abundance of spirit, and policies of participation. And I'm first going to pass over to Stephen Kite as the editor of the chapters aligned to humanity and delight.
Thank you, Mary. This page from a 15th century Roman de la Rose embodies the spirit of generosity and architecture in its aspects of humanity and delight. This part of the book contains 8 chapters of broad historical, cultural, and geographical range. Some examples. In Chestertown, Maryland, USA, the Waterlines riverbank installation created inspiring spaces of shared experience for diverse communities through music, dance, and video. In London, the delight that Joseph Bazalgette's Victoria Embankment sewer system provided as a new riverside space of promenade. In the arts and crafts domestic interior, the romantic pleasures offered by Morris and Webb's abundant surfaces. In the Muslim Malay marketplace, the affordances of the staircase as a stage, through whose patterns male and female traders and customers become both actors and audience. In Italy, Spain, India, and Vietnam, how generosity is claimed serendipitously from the most forbidding urban surfaces through hybrid grafts such as facade benches and informal street shops. In Scotland, how the site itself is a gifting to the design of the house project. In Nepal, the pleasures of encounter with the child clients of their primary school. And back in London, as we shall shortly learn from Sian Moxon, the joys of rewilding a London residential street. Returning to our manuscript, this image, loved by John Ruskin and William Morris, represents an outdoor room, a hortus ludi paradise garden for delight and social intercourse. Such aperspectival medieval images influenced the layered surfaces of Philip Webb and Morris's Red House. And Morris's News from Nowhere of 1892 calls for a social and ecological revolution to give humanity an equal share in beauty and delight, where, quote, "The spirit of the new days of our days is a delight in the life of the world, intense and overweening love of the very skin and surface of the earth on which we dwell," end quote. In 1859, Morris's Kelmscott Press published John Ruskin's chapter on the nature of Gothic from his Stones of Venice, which Morris revered as one of the very few necessary and inevitable utterances of the century. For Ruskin, generosity is the character as belonging to the builder, which equates to redundance as belonging to the building. Such redundance, says Ruskin, is characterized in architecture by the uncalculating bestowal of the wealth of its labor, and by an unselfishness of sacrifice, arising out of a profound sympathy with the fullness and wealth of the material universe, end quote. In its moral and social aspects, generosity describes high-minded acts of social giving. In its mental aspect, it carries the related sense of high-spiritedness, of joy, gladness, and delight. For some, we are now traditionally in the season of Lent, as good a time as any to interrogate the boundaries between generosity and excess. Is that philanthropically endowed gallery really an uncalculating bestowal to the common good? Or is it in truth an act of vanity designed to mask individual or corporate greed? Thank you. I'll now hand over to Charles to introduce the Abundance of Spirit section of the book.
Thank you, Stephen. I guess just to give some context as to my participation in the editorship of the book, it really came from a frustration that, or kind of something that was brewing in my head, that we're transiting into a type of economy where we need to redefine or at least reflect upon odd concepts that pertain to ownership or abundance. And it's kind of it's in that kind of spirit of reflectiveness that we were working together on the Abundance of Spirit. And it's the section is obviously continuing the theme of the intersections of generosity and architecture, but through the lens of its socio-political aspects, and inspired by the writings of authors who contributed to or developed particular schools of thought, where ideas that we felt were necessary to deconstruct the concept of generosity emerged. And in that aspect, we were kind of examining how generosity can be acted out in the field of architectural design, or at least in the examples that we discussed. And the authors included Jacques Rancière, who talked about the legality of possibilities to offer spatial arrangements in a political context, Georges Bataille, who talked about ideas of abundance, Marcel Mauss, who talked about gift giving, and Jean Deleuze, who talked about ideas of lack or lacking, and so forth. And in this reflective context, we looked at the contemporary and recent problematics of generosity, what it means to perhaps offer more than what is expected in a contractual arrangement. We described situations where generosity is rarely the binary exchange that arises from abundance, but actually comes from situations of poverty, given more where there's little to offer in the first place. But the spirit of offering that I think we captured is embedded in a nuanced interrelation between maybe not opulent or rich donations, but rather a deep understanding of the social cultural situations where acts of kindness find their strongest foundations and obviously may be embedded in an architectural form. And in doing this, the section targets situations where the process of design or the resulting architecture played a role as a tool in the toolbox that allows more access to a shared space and participating in a civic dialogue more intentionally. Starting from the very first chapter that the image on the slide is from, by Chris Smith, who discusses the need of the body for a generous, expansive space, a space where the body can express its sexual and political presence. And in this ethical strand, we carry through the dialogue to other chapters to discuss the presence of subcultures or whole ethnic groups in public, acting out their right to be, share stories, or even just move through space in an unobstructed way. My text looks at the first design parkour park in Denmark and how it establishes the practice of moving in a different way as an element of the civic debate, of civic life. Phoebe Chrisman looks at the design collaboration that she had with the Dakota tribe and the opportunities to think about architecture that resulted from it. Shelley Cohen talks about empathy in acts of philanthropy in case of a design of a library and a school for Palestinian children. Juan Zubliaga discusses the design practice of Santiago Quirogueda, who plays on the fringes of legality and proposes new ways of living, playing, and being in nature in Spain, while Xavier Bernal presents architecture in its totality, the definition thereof, or as something which is beyond the boundaries of what is expected and always creates synergies with the outside. And the section is framed by two graphic essays by Albert van Jaarsveld, Sarah Ackland, and Suzanne Touch from Rect Architecture that showcase how the overlooked people and ways of designing can become active players in the curation and shaping of a public space. And with that, I'll hand over to Mari, who'll talk about the last section.
Right, thank you so much, Stephen and Charles. Just to carry on. So as with Charles, my interest in editing the policies of participation section of generosity in architecture emerged from the roles that I held and still hold, as Ambrose has noted, as an architectural academic and activist member of a group of residents who took on the civic asset of a small community facility. And this was in a context of the political withdrawal of the state from the maintenance and development of civic facilities and services and accompanying economic budgets in the UK, starting from 2011 onwards, which invited and in some cases demanded the generosity of community volunteers and architects working with them to step up and take over assets. RIBA's Guide to Localism in the same period recommended that architects support such processes by being involved with communities right from the very beginning. A challenge to this ambition was the lack of funding available to emerging community groups as they tried to begin a project. And a guide to stepping up in Cardiff advised community groups doing such projects that architects might give their services for free at the early stages of a project. So for me, this led to research which aimed to track exactly what it took to take on a civic facility and to measure how much generosity would be demanded of everyone involved who took on the development of the facility. So the resultant mapping shown here in an image beautifully created by Sarah Ackland followed the first 3 years of emails, meetings and events generated by a voluntary group taking over a civic facility in Grangetown in Cardiff. And Sarah's image here makes visible the hidden generosities demanded of everyone stepping up to take on this small civic space and giving a sense of what it means to be involved right from the start means. And this image captures only 3 years of a 10-year co-production process. So the final chapters in the book explore the role of the architect variously as facilitator, mediator, and advisor, working with unconventional programs, clients and sites, and taking on the challenges of addressing a housing crisis and declining civic infrastructure, supporting those taking on long-term care of social infrastructure, and addressing the question of who ultimately benefits from temporary use of vacated spaces, or employing methods of tactical urbanism in politically, economically, and socially contested spaces, or tackling the accessibility or inaccessibility of planning processes. And we'll hear about aspects of these questions from the chapter presented by Jane in this section. So generosity and architecture opens with a letter from Natalie Weddick of the Irish Architecture Foundation. Natalie writes that generosity becomes more complex and provocative the more we scratch the surface. She introduces the term reciprocity. Generosity, Natalie writes, is inert without reciprocity. Sorry, getting around the word. Reciprocity is the gift that keeps giving, that makes it possible to build continuing relationships and exchanges. Natalie concludes that there is a duty of trust and a moral obligation to do well with each other. And I think this is a thread that runs through all the chapters in generosity and architecture. While alert to injustices of exploitation, meanness, lack, and conditions which demand rather than invite generosity, the authors commonly align quality in architecture as an obligation to do well with each other. The cases discussed in the book embody motivations of care, goodwill, and love for others, even when, or especially when, there's a scarcity of means. So thanks very much, and we look forward to the presentations and the following discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. A digital round of applause, I think. Yeah, indeed. Yeah, very, very wonderful and precise, and you've given me 2 minutes extra. So thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you, Charles, for those very clear unpacking of it. I want to hand over quite quickly to our next two speakers, Sean Moxon and Jane Klossick, who are going to, they have 10 minutes each, which is quite generous, to speak about their chapters within the book. And I'm going to get to introduce them, which is, it feels rather cheeky, but I'm going to get to introduce them. Just to say, I went to university with Jane, so I've known Jane since Jane was an undergraduate and I was a postgraduate at Sheffield. So we've communicated a tiny bit over the years. So when Jane emailed me, I was so delighted, because it's always nice to think that someone somewhere remembers you. But I'm going to hand over to the two of them. But to introduce them first, I've got three screens. I feel like Tom Cruise in Minority Report, and I'm losing touch with some of them. But to introduce Jane is senior lecturer in architecture and urbanism at London Metropolitan University, and she coordinates the city's research group there. She is currently involved in two research projects: Spaces of Birth and Death, which is a collaboration between architects and philosophers exploring how to make small improvements with big impact, and her ongoing exploration of high street started during her PhD, in which she has recently published an edited book with UCL Press called Everyday Streets: Inclusive Approaches to Understanding and Design. Quite like that "and" in there, that's doing some work. Her research interests include urban depth and city morphology, high streets, industrial and workspace accommodation, participatory design processes, and activism through design, which is to say that Jane is really good at a lot of things. Sean, hello Sean, it's nice to digitally meet you, is a senior lecturer in sustainable design, also at London Met School of Architecture, Art, Architecture and Design, Art, Architecture and Design. Sean's practice-led design research explores urban biodiversity within the cities group at the Centre for Urban and Built Ecologies, CUBE. Sean leads the Environment Challenge for London Met Lab and the Art, Architecture and Design Education Declares Working Group. She is an architect, an author, and a founder of the award-winning Rewild My Street urban wilding campaign. And her paper, her presentation today is called Rewild My Street, a model for community-led urban rewilding from the Generosity and Architecture Conference. And Jane's paper is called Generosity and Participation on the Old Kent Road, a road I have recently got to know through Google Earth. So I'm going to hand over, as per the program, to Jane to begin. Jane, the floor is yours.
I think the floor might be Sean's.
Oh,
it is.
Sean, the floor is yours. I was just being generous on your behalf.
Yeah.
We will take questions at the very end in terms of all of this, because otherwise we would, I know what would happen. I would say, let's have one interesting question, and then the question would possibly drag on a bit and it would become a discussion. So I want to hold the questions off right to the end, and then obviously we'll do the usual thing. But ladies and gentlemen, Sean Moxon, thank you.
Thank you, Ambrose. Hopefully everyone can see the presentation okay there. So Ambrose has already explained the title of my book chapter, which you can see there. And my book chapter was a photo essay on my project, Rewild My Street, which was actually effectively launched at the Generosity conference. So it's really nice to be able to show how it's progressed since 2018. So because my chapter is fairly short on text, I'm going to read it out for you, Jackanory style, and show some relevant images along the way. So nature is unintentionally generous to humans. It provides ecosystem services, resources and processes such as building materials and flood prevention, valued at over 920 billion in the UK. Moreover, spending time in nature, natural environments, boosts our health and well-being, having a restorative effect. Humans are less benevolent to nature, causing habitat destruction, pollution, and climate change through overexploitation of natural resources. As a consequence, global populations of wildlife have declined by almost 70% from 1970, and we would need 1.5 Earths to sustain our lifestyle. There is therefore both a moral duty and a survival imperative to address the imbalance. Rural rewilding projects that restore natural habitats and reconnect people with nature are encouraging. The same principle should be applied in urban environments where over 80% of the UK population lives. City dwellers would benefit from additional green space and wildlife, as spending time in a natural space lowers stress, and more biodiverse urban areas boost residents' well-being. Further, cities would be enhanced in terms of appearance, air quality, and resilience to climate change. In parallel, cities can help wildlife, providing important habitat and helping the recovery of species such as hedgehogs. London offers an opportunity to pilot urban rewilding, having become the world's first national park city in 2019. With its mayor pledging to increase green infrastructure to 50% and tree cover by 12% by 2050. Private gardens, which make up 24% of the UK capital, are crucial to this agenda. However, the equivalent of 2.5 Hyde Parks of green space is lost each year as residents replace vegetation with hard surfaces, having a significant detrimental effect on their garden's biodiversity value. Regulation cannot reverse this trend, as existing gardens largely fall outside its scope. Meanwhile, initiatives to increase greenery prioritise new buildings and public space. It is therefore vital to educate residents on managing their own gardens for wildlife, requiring a new model for empowering communities. To this end, the Rewild My Street campaign was launched by a team of architects and ecologists, offering a design toolkit to help Londoners transform their homes, gardens, and streets to attract wildlife. The guidance is collated in an open access website, rewildmystreet.org. The project uses architectural drawings to demonstrate how a typical terrace street could be adapted to increase its biodiversity, aiming to inspire residents to add wildlife features by showing how they can be successfully integrated. Keys cross-reference the drawings to external links to products and activities to help residents attract wildlife, and to expert information on species and habitats to highlight the value of doing so. So this is the sectional perspective drawing of a proposed street highlighting potential urban wildlife species, such as the hedgehog, and then the key link through to external advice from Hedgehog Street. This is the plan drawing of the proposed street highlighting potential urban wildlife habitats, such as a mini meadow. And again, the key links through to external guidance, in this case from Kew Gardens on why meadows matter. This is the front and rear garden elevation drawings of the proposed street, highlighting products to attract urban wildlife, including a container pond, which you can buy off the shelf as a complete kit. And finally, this is the aerial view drawing of the proposed street, highlighting activities to attract urban wildlife, such as creating a bat tile. And in this case, these link through to our own pattern drawings, as we call them, which kind of set out the design considerations of doing these things. And so in the case of the bats, these are lots of different things that could be done, including a bat roof tile to attract bats. So more major proposals are in the wrong order. The model is intended to be practical rather than radical to ensure its success, as shown on this Wild Makeover Guide. And most of the measures proposed are simple, inexpensive, and easily achievable. Each adaptation can be made in isolation, either through a do-it-yourself activity or off-the-shelf product. And these small actions by individual householders could quickly accumulate across a street, neighbourhood, and city, and link to other habitats such as parks. More major proposals are suggested in the public realm to encourage residents to lobby their council for changes. These are the monthly Wild Makeover tips that I send out. So there's one for Valentine's Day theme for February just gone. And you can see there that there's a more major kind of public space intervention in terms of thinking about street trees in one of those. The project offers a scalable model for urban rewilding, which could underpin the creation of a global network of national park cities and foster a more symbiotic relationship between humans and nature. And I wanted to highlight here from the National Park City website that Adelaide has now joined the list of national park cities, and it's good because we've got Cardiff in the house to see that Cardiff is one of those which is on the pathway to becoming one, so that would be great to see. And indeed, the project has been referenced in Australia, so it's having good reach in this article on making space for wildness in Australian cities, which highlights the efforts of Rewild My Street in London as a potential inspiration for what could happen there. The model itself embodies generosity by sharing specialist architectural knowledge and skills for public benefit and providing an educational tool for ongoing community participation in change. The intended outcome of creating sustainable urban environments where humans and other species can coexist will offer something to life beyond humanity, but is hardly selfless when greening streets benefits cities and the many people that live in them. And this recent ZSL London Zoo report on rewilding our cities highlighted all those benefits of rewilding, and indeed mentions Rewild My Street as a good example of how to engage communities in this process, which is seen as vital. The project highlights the potential of generosity in architecture to tackle urgent environmental problems and could inspire other designers to share creative solutions to drive changes in the built environment. Similar projects could focus on other environmental issues, building types, or climates to collectively engage the public in the sustainable redevelopment of cities. Thank you so much, and please do scan the QR code if you would like to check out the website and sign up.
Thank you very much, Sian. I think a round of applause, silent or not, a really elegant presentation, but also a really elegant project with some terrific images. And I've got loads of questions, but it's not mine to ask questions, so which is very difficult. So instead, I'm going to hand straight on to Jane, who is going to give us a presentation on her work on Old Kent Road. Jane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Is that successfully shared? Excellent. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Sian. That was really great. And thanks, Ambrose, for the very kind introduction. And I thoroughly enjoyed your introduction to the book too, Mari and Charles and Stephen. It was really great to have that overview. Today, I'm going to talk about the potential generosity in making planning policy consultations accessible. And I'm going to look at some case studies from my research around the Old Kent Road, which I've been engaged in for about 8 years in collaboration with Mark Brearley. So in this presentation, I am going to talk about planning in Southwark, urban depth and accessibility, the space of possibilities, the business consultation meeting, a workshop, which was called Planning Action OKR, and I'll draw some conclusions. In the paper in the Generosity book, I compared 3 projects in the Old Kent Road, which is in the London Borough of Southwark, using the analytical framework of urban depth and how that can be read in community consultation projects and used as a partial indicator of their success. The 2 theories which I've employed are urban depth and accessibility and the space of possibilities. And the 2 case studies here, the business consultation meeting and planning action OKR, were 2 of the studies which I employed in the paper, but I haven't managed to fit in the 3rd one because I don't think there's time. So in the context of Southwark, this image shows all the businesses in the Old Kent Road opportunity area as were in existence in 2016. The London Borough of Southwark has been producing the Old Kent Road Area Action Plan, and there's been multiple iterations of that plan. And that includes an intention to build 20,000 new homes, new schools, open space, public realm, health and community facilities. And this is a longer and more complex story, but the headline is there's not enough space for industrial businesses. So considering the number of businesses which were to be affected by the policy changes and the de-designation in particular of industrial areas, participation in the planning process in terms of responding to consultations by businesses was insufficient in our opinion. And for the last half a decade in the city's research group, we've been undertaking action research to try and ameliorate this. By 2018, which I think was the 3rd iteration of the Area Action Plan, only 14% of the businesses in the opportunity area had been directly contacted by the Borough of Southwark. So the 2 theories, the first is urban depth, and that's a theory I developed during my PhD, and it's to do with thinking about architecture in terms of its depth, a way of understanding how people encounter buildings in space. And in particular, considering where is a building positioned on the street network? Where is it in its urban block? How many thresholds do you need to cross to get to where you're aiming for in the building? How open is the depth? Can you see from inside to outside? And in addition to these spatial factors, there are also other types of factor that enhance accessibility, like opening hours and the communication of relevant knowledge, and what's the nature of the gatekeeping at the different thresholds within urban depth? Is it welcoming or is it excluding? And also, to what extent is publicity effective? Are there signs and posters? Was it sent out on an email list? This type of information. Then there's the space of possibilities, and that's based on a theory from Eileen Conn, who argued that power in society, in particular around planning, is structured in 2 ways. There's the vertical hierarchical system and the horizontal peer system. And you can see from this diagram who fits into those 2 different sorts of system. And for all to participate in urban democracy, these 2 different types of organisation, which communicate very differently with each other and have very different power structures, they need to come together in a space of possibilities. And for me, the space of possibilities is a real place in time and space, and it's where a consultation event or a similar event takes place. So now I'm going to talk about 2 of those events and the nature of the space of possibilities in terms of urban depth. So the first one was a business consultation event organised by Southwark Council, and it was held in this building, which is the New Covenant Church on the Old Kent Road. I think it was in 2018. And in the Paper and Generosity book, I've done a detailed analysis, which you can see on the left of this slide. But just to summarise, this building, while it is very spatially accessible at the front of Urban Depth on the main road, the event itself lacked any signage outside, meaning that only invited guests could come in. There are 2 thresholds to cross, and it's a church, which is not necessarily welcoming to everybody. There was no visual connection to the meeting inside to the street. And there wasn't enough time even for many of the businesses locally to attend. People who run businesses are incredibly busy. So only 45 people attended of the 9,500 employees in the Old Kent Road opportunity area. The second that I want to add as a comparator was where we tried to rectify some of the mistakes made by Southwark at the business consultation meeting. We wanted to empower local businesses with information about the proposed planning policy changes. So our event, this was the second of 2, took place in 231 Old Kent Road, which is a specifically designed shop. Again, it's a longer story that you can find out about if you read some of the information on our website, but it was intended as a hub for planning information. And it's extremely spatially accessible, just like the New Covenant Church. It's right on the front of Depth. But one of the key differences is that it has an open frontage and signage, and the language of shop says, come in. It's got a single threshold. We did extensive amounts of promotion. And our event was 2 days long. So in terms of time, it was also much more accessible. And several businesses attended. We had more than 45 people from the business community and over 150 people in total. And also it was a lot more interactive. And I think the people came away empowered to respond to the consultation. We also had deliberately welcoming gatekeeping, where we ushered people in off the street and gave them cups of tea as soon as they walked through the door. So my argument is underpinned by these 2 concepts of urban depth and the spatiality of vertical and horizontal systems of power. And I bring those 2 together and say that in that space of possibilities, you need to ensure through these elements that you are very generous. Opening hours, clarity of communication, publicity, gatekeeping, the location on the street, the visibility of the facade, signage and entrances. And I strongly believe it's our ethical responsibility as built environment professionals to ensure that the space of possibilities is accessible to the stakeholders for whom a planning consultation is relevant. Thank you very much. I enjoyed putting together that presentation. I sort of wished I could have rewritten my paper a bit when I started putting together my presentation. If you want to find out more about our work, our website is very comprehensive, and that's the website address. And do feel free to get in touch with me if you have any ideas for collaboration or if you want to know anything more. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jane. That was fabulous, beautiful, and you even gave a very good impression of speaking off the cuff, which is extremely bold. Thank you. So we move into the third last section of this session, which is a panel discussion on generosity. And I wanted to, obviously this is for all 5 of our guests today, so Sean, Mari, Charles, Stephen and Jane. Now, as I said, I've been writing down loads of questions, but I think it might be nice to start off by asking people if they would like to ask a question. Obviously, we have 2 instruments to hand for this. We have the raising of the yellow hand, or we have putting comments in the comment box. And that was the advice I was given. The comments in the comment box means I can gather them together and perhaps find thematic areas that so we don't get repetitive questions, but I don't think we will anyway. So if there are any questions to begin with, please raise your hand or drop something in the comments, and I will deliver them to the guests. Which is very good that I took note. Oh, to begin with, and without a great deal of surprise, Jane, would you? Jane Clossick has a question.
Are we allowed to ask questions of one another?
I think that's a really good place to start, actually. I think that's a pretty elegant place to start, rather than me chipping in. So how about that?
I wanted to talk about, or ask Sian really, about the nature of which are the institutions that you envisage being generous in rewilding, or is it all driven by individual generosity with the space over which we are the stewards, our own homes and our own gardens?
So I see it as about being generous as an architect or a practitioner or researcher in terms of providing a strategy and a toolkit that can then inspire and empower the individuals to make changes. But of course, it could equally inspire other designers and to do strategic work or design on behalf of someone else, or indeed councils to start doing these kind of things in public space. And I think listening to your talk, it'd be interesting to think about how, if those two things, industry depth and rewilding, are compatible or incompatible in those much more inner city areas.
Thank you very much, Jane. Thanks, Sian. I wanted to ask a little bit to sort of set the scene in terms of this panel discussion. I wanted to kind of, something I noticed with all your presentations and the papers and my experience of the conference as I remember it, there's this interesting thing of scale jumping that goes on in all of these papers, where this concept of generosity is both used to kind of critique systemic issues and critique large-scale spaces, physical spaces, but it's also grounded, and that's the word obviously that Murray used at the very beginning in our first presentation this evening. It's also grounded in a very kind of intimate and person-centered, bodily, which is a word Charles used, bodily kind of thing. And I was wondering whether we could reflect a little bit around that just for a couple of minutes. This idea of generosity being working at two scales simultaneously, which I think might relate to Jane's question, which is this idea of, like, how do you achieve the sharing of domestic space, which is like what policy, like what philosophical, ethical frameworks, what, you know, it's got this kind of diversity. So I was wondering if there was any reflections on that. And I saw this in all of the presentations, so I can, maybe if we could start with Mary, as you spoke the longest ago.
Sure, and I think it relates to a question I had for both Sian and Jane, and commonalities between their papers about small individual acts of generosity. And I think it was Jane who said small improvements with big impact. This idea of generosity being a reaction to larger processes that aren't working. You know, so why do we need to rewild the city? Because there aren't enough statutory protections in place, and the statutory protections that are in place protect cars and vehicular traffic. And so these small acts of sort of rebellion and generosity, almost as an individual act of rebellion, but as a catalytic effect that starts to build up to the point that you then have evidence of it working, but also evidence of the interest to start pushing, you know, your local councillor, then your local authority, and then up to government levels to start changing the policies that are in place in the first place. And Jane's discussion of the ethical need to support space of possibilities, and that not being statutory, right? Because developers can get away with very little in terms of community consultation. There's no need for them to do it, really. I mean, they can get away with the absolute bare minimum. So this idea of it being an ethical duty and a moral duty And at what point do those individual acts start to lead up to it becoming statutory, so that the generosity almost isn't required? So I don't know if that sort of poses a question, but it was just an observation about that relationship of individual acts of generosity eventually leading to an impact on larger scale policies.
Yes, I think that's Jane, do you want to respond?
It struck me, does that mean that generosity isn't generosity if it's statutory?
Or is generosity
only
not
generosity if
required?
it's given freely? Is that I don't actually know what the definition of generosity is.
I gave them both. It means big or lots. And I think the state can be generous. It's ambiguous, isn't it? The boundaries of it are ambiguous. Charles, what do you reckon? You're the man of words. Pick that apart.
I feel that we should this raise a conversation that we had by email during the editing process, and the conversations that we've had, all of us had during the conference, and as we were discussing individual chapters. And something I think that made its way into the introduction or the book application, I don't think I remember now, that there's quite often that there's a tendency to think of an agenda when it comes to larger scale acts of generosity or philanthropy, where, especially in architecture, where a building is donated, especially in American education systems, to campuses, university campuses, and they're being named after the person who donates the money. Whereas in small acts of generosity, those acts of kindness, where perhaps reciprocity is not explicit or not even intended, that's where we that's where I guess most of our chapters found that true kindness of generosity, that gentleness of being noble, I guess.
I think this is a really interesting idea. Does anybody, Stephen, do you want to comment on this? Because I think there is correlations between the kind of the moral language that's coming through in this conversation. And we can use ethical because it makes us feel less awkward, but the word probably is moral, and the work of people like Ruskin, who you mentioned.
Yes, well, on your scale point, I mean, one thread running through all of this is the ecological one. Yeah, very strongly in Ruskin and Morris, everything is enacted against the vast abundance of nature, that is the ultimate generosity, that the abundance of nature in which we operate. Though the point that biodiversity in the last 20 years has dropped by 60%, nature suddenly doesn't look so abundant anymore. But that, in Morris's case, the response to that abundance of nature, to the wonderful earth veil that we inhabit, which is also very fragile and thin, that veil, that fertile veil across the surface of the earth, as it were, can be reflected in a piece of wallpaper, which is a sort of very domestic piece of generosity. So there's the scale of the generosity, and then there's the question: how impactful is it to put up a nice piece of wallpaper when the earth is on fire? I think that's the sort of question that's also at work. Do we operate at a governmental level? That was the question. Rewild My Street. How impactful is it to make a pond? Or I think the answer is yes, very impactful. Because if everyone didn't hard pave their front yards, you'd be getting 3 Hyde Parks back. So I think there's a whole lot of agendas there about the backcloth of nature, the scale of interaction, and how impactful that all is. And a small act of generosity can be more impactful than we think, or a small act of design. And I think that has come out in all the papers and the talks and the conference. And your point, about scale, I think is a very important one. The other thing we mentioned in the introduction, going back to the historical thesaurus of the English Oxford Dictionary, was quite useful, because it talks about a physical a physical level of generosity, a mental level of generosity, and a social level of generosity. And I was thinking, when you were talking about urban depths, you were talking about as a sort of physical manifestations of depth, but there's also, which also interacts with a sort of social. So I think that way of thinking of generosity on a physical, mental, and social level can also be, it's crude, but it's also quite useful. It's something we unpacked a bit in the introduction, and I think that's going on in all the papers and in all the discussions as well.
Sean, oh, Jane or Sean? Sean put a wee yellow hand up, so she can go.
Thank you. Yeah, so just to echo that, I think that issue of scale is really pertinent, and I think what I'm trying to do to be different from, I'd say, conservation organisations that are doing this kind of thing and to be architectural about it is to think about the street scale. And once you stop thinking about your house or your garden as an extension of another room in your house, and you can do what you want with it, and it doesn't make a difference if you want to kind of put artificial grass down or something because it's easier. Once you start thinking it as part of a kind of habitat corridor, if you like, of all these gardens joined together that link up to wider spaces, and you see the value of it as part of a potential bigger whole, I think that's really, really vital, of that issue of those small things adding one pond, contributing to what your neighbour might be doing, or what the next road are doing. And I think, you know, as someone who kind of teaches sustainable design more generally, for all environmental issues, yes, it has to come across all those levels of the vertical hierarchy. It has to come from government, it has to come from councils, but it has to come from individuals. And we have to see that we have power and agency to make a difference through our everyday choices. And I think that's true for rewilding, and that's true for bigger environmental issues generally.
Beautiful, thank you. Jane, you are, or do you want to say some more, Sean?
No,
Oh, no.
I was just thought I was unhanding.
Jane.
I was going to talk about a personal experience, which is that in our flat, we have 4 families and we've taken down the fences between our gardens. And between us, we've got 12 children and quite a significant amount of garden. But it's the fact of the sharing that has enabled us to have quite large patches, and lack of gardening as well, has enabled us to have quite large patches of wildness relative to what we would individually have, because the children have got their own bit with play equipment in, that if you divided that in between all the gardens, it would take up all the space. So it's amazing how much you can achieve by collaborating with just a few neighbours. But I don't know anybody else who has a living situation like this in London. It came about very slowly over time because my husband is probably the world's friendliest man and just it makes friends with everybody left, right and centre. And I don't think it would have happened if I lived here by myself, for example. So I think it is really, I wonder if there is some mechanisms which probably already exist actually for helping people to start to collaborate on things like, let's have a meadow that stretches across both of the end of our gardens. And it feels like this, especially in the digital world, there are all sorts of existing structures that you could start to piggyback on. And certainly, yeah, I don't know how this links in with the larger scale.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because it strikes me as being something to do with desire and values, and you can't really legislate. You can't really policy that. You can't insist on generosity. It has to come from. I mean, you simply can't, because they've been trying to do it. Well, you know, the state has been trying to do it for decades, and it hasn't done it. In fact, possibly it's done the opposite. So I think that is a kind of interesting thing. Charles, you put your hand back up, but we do have, in fact, you put it up twice. But we do also have a question from Julia Atkins. So perhaps we go to Charles and Julia, then we'll ask your question. Hear your question.
I'm not sure that I can.
Okay.
I'm not sure that I can articulate my comments in the same language as you, but from my researches, Jane, you're not alone, because in dear old Victorian Dulwich, people are building gateways through their back gardens for the children to play, because they can't play in the street. But I'm also fascinated by Sean's research and just lovely presentation, which is wonderful for street properties. But I come from a local authority background that has managed, you know, the grottiest of council estates in the London Borough of Southwark, I have to say, where, you know, there's a lot of land that's sort of communally available, but is not used and is not loved. You know, I can see in the middle class street properties back to back, you've got your, you know, I'm looking over a corridor of trees and back gardens. You know, that's, you know, that's not the whole sort of living experience for people in cities. And so I think more thinking has to be done. Maybe it is on the grander scale, but, you know, how to apply such ideas and participation of how to encourage communities who don't live in street properties. I don't have anything else to comment, but
thank you very much, Julia. That's very. Does anybody want to respond, or shall I? Yeah, Sean.
Yeah, I can respond if you want. Thank you, Julia. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not the full picture. The idea is it's a kind of typical street, but obviously there's no real such thing as a typical street. But we do have a drawing of a balcony, for example, and how you can pack in loads of wildlife features to a balcony. And of course, all those kind of communal, say, leftover spaces. Things like in Chiswick, Abundance London are doing really good work engaging communities to create meadows in those kind of incidental, residual, if you like, spaces. So there is good practice happening around that kind of thing as well, which if you don't have your own garden or outdoor space is an option.
Thank you, Sean. I did see another hand up. It was Neil Farker. Would you like to ask, or have you decided to become supremely shy? Apparently so. Charles, you were going to respond earlier. Is that still pertinent?
Oh, just wanted to kind of to add a few points to the conversation about the idea of the scale and how the notion of how our attitude to nature responds to it. Just made me think of the situation that we're targeted with, constantly targeted with issues that are on a global scale quite difficult to tackle, such as sustainability. You know, there's this notion that our world is on fire, the world that we live in is on fire, or national wars between countries. And it is difficult to tackle those issues, but I think that in a certain sense, tackling those issues on an individual scale and on the scale of a community is probably the way to go. You know, sustainability has been tried to be tackled on a national scale in several countries, and we're still not getting anywhere as quickly as we should be. Whereas working with creating ponds, you know, rewilding the street, perhaps is actually making a difference. That isn't as picked up on perhaps on a national scale, which probably it should.
Yeah.
I think that's the problematic of the kind of streams of communication that we're working with at the moment, that there is this kind of jumping between scales and there's no communication between them. And I think that it was really lovely to hear Jane's presentation about the space, an actual space for a community, something that Murray is doing as well. To see those spaces come up and arise and working, because there's so little of them.
Thank you, Charles. Murray.
Yeah, I think it's to also return to Julia's point, which I think is so pertinent. It's just where do you begin, you know? And I think what I really enjoyed about both Sean and Jane's papers is that they take really complex, enormous problems that can just be incredibly overwhelming. You know, how do you begin getting green space in the city? How do you consult with communities? And it narrows down to, okay, here's a first tangible action you can do. You know, and it can be as simple as, and it's that sharing of you know, I think, Sean, you described it as the sharing of specialist knowledge, just making it freely available, because you know you can spend, I don't know, what, 5-10K just at having somebody look at what your garden should be. And so where do you begin if you know nothing? And it's just having that first sort of step. And then in Jane's case, it's, you know, just make it inviting, you know, make it look welcoming, you know, just really, really simple steps that start to nudge generosity. And I think it's sort of returning to the question that Jane raised about, you know, don't we need generosity if it isn't statutory, or what happens if you're trying to nudge it towards that? I think it's the idea that generosity isn't a given, and we're not always aware of where there is a lack of generosity until you start to experience it as a lack of generosity. And it's that sort of really gentle nudging towards generosity at a bigger scale, and just lots of small acts of kindness and giving that start to nudge something on a broader scale. So again, I don't know if that quite captures it, but that's what's starting to emerge as a response.
Thank you very much. Now, Jane, you have your hand up again, and Matthew Barrick has his hand up, and I'm guessing we'll start with Jane, and then we'll go to Matthew.
I was reflecting that somebody mentioned that the space on the Old Kent Road, that 231 Old Kent Road, and that is a shop which was originally, it was converted after a crowdfunder where about £60,000 was raised, and the intention of that place was that it would become this hub of planning information so that local people could go in, there would be surgeries there with planners and that type of thing, but that it would be administered by a local community action group. And as it happens, and I'm not quite sure of the mechanism, now Southwark seem to be in charge of it, and the function is not quite what was intended. However, bringing it into being has required an enormous amount of interpersonal generosity of the actors involved. So loads of architects have given lots of their time, and lots of local community groups give loads of their time. We've given a lot of our time. I've given so much of my time that I've burned out with giving my time. So the relationship between these spatial manifestations of generosity and individual people generously giving their time is very strong. Like, you get great generous outputs when a lot of people give their time. And I think to relate that to reciprocity, it doesn't take a lot actually of reciprocal action for people to feel like that generosity is worth it to them. And I think also some kind of mapping and understanding of what do people get when they are generous is worthwhile to understand what prompts people to do it. So that's just a comment. And Matthew, I'll pass on to you, I'm sure.
Thank you, Jane.
Thanks, Jane. I had a question that is unrelated, but while Mari, Stephen, and George were talking, sorry, Charles, not George. I just pulled up the book. Well, going through the various chapters. I pulled up the book partly because I recognized the name of a former student as one of the chapter contributors, which kind of piqued my interest, knowing that he's studied at Cape Town, where I taught him, and now not directly linked to this project in a way that these conferences often happen through networks which are quite local. And then I went through the chapter structure as a whole and recognized that it's a very international book with a great deal of cultural diversity. And this spread of chapters also, you know, is and the kind of internationalism of it seems to come across in contrast to the sometimes very specific, especially for empirical research, local situated research, where the cultural specificity is expressed often in a lot of difference. Each research project is very different from another. And I just wondered, probably from an editorial perspective, whether the international or cross-cultural implications of the editorial project gave rise to any observations or readings that talked about generosity with regard to the extent to which it might be seen as part of a cultural tradition, or whether it's a kind of spontaneous expression. I mean, there must have been some reading between the lines, as it were, that came from the editorial process, where generosity gives rise to the theme of generosity gives rise to, if you like, the perhaps sometimes provincialized versions of generosity that might affect our reading of it. So if this book is coming from let's say, a British perspective, did the spread, the internationalism and cross-cultural aspect of the book open more doors about what generosity might be, or how it might be interpreted more broadly?
Thank you, Matthew. We don't have very long, so maybe could we start with Stephen? If you've got any responses to that, to Matthew's questions about the insights you gain through the editing process.
Yeah, I think your point about the international was something we were very alert to as editors, and thinking about what to include. I mean, in the Humanity and Delight section, for example, one of the chapters was on the Muslim-Malay marketplace, for example, and in Islamic contexts, you don't often get women traders, but that brought the Muslim-Malay Islamic marketplace is distinctive for having women traders, and the pattern there of the staircase as a stage was an interesting aspect there. And then we had the schools in Nepal. So it did bring up lots of different cultural diversity, which I think is a aspect of the book, and one we were keen to include, I think. Yeah. And just to point on this reciprocity, I mean, we end the introduction about part of generosity is finding a fair balance between abundance and need. That's one of the big the big reciprocities that's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mari, Charles, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly say that the motivation for the topic came out of UK austerity budgets, which we were living through at the time, and this was, a kind of pre-Brexit and pre-COVID situation. So there was a lot of discussion around what austerity budgets meant, and I think as we widened the call out and had an international audience coming in, there was a sense of what's happening globally. So where did we see the same kinds of drawing back of the state, or the same the same sort of motivations happening in other countries? But I think there was also an interest in where can we share best practice across and between countries that had slightly different policies or procedures, or greater, or I guess more obvious evidence of poverty and wealth distinctions, and what could that then bring back to our understanding of our own context. So yeah, I think there was an interesting sort of sharing of best practice, which to some extent has continued through, because we've remained in touch with several of the authors, and we're starting to get policy discussions between them. And I think Sian showed that in her work as well. The way in which things that feel like a relatively small act in one country then get picked up in another, and you start to get a momentum towards that.
Thanks ever so much, Mari. Charles, do you have any comments?
I think one thing that struck me was the kind of the variety in which generosity can be acted out, where the aspect of generosity can become an architectural feat, such as a metabolist structure in South Africa, where it's relatively formalized example thereof. But it also can be very simple, and it's something that perhaps if I were to look at one of the designs that was described by Shelley Cohen, who talked about a library in public, which consisted only of 2 bookshelves, and that allowed the people that were in the library, the mothers with children, to escape the other direction if they saw an armed soldier that wanted to detain them. And so it's something that I would completely have missed if I were to look at that structure. And it's that kind of that locality of the context and the possibilities that type of generosity allows, that kind of drew from the cultural specificity of the people that contributed to our book and the variety thereof. A metabolist structure is something that I would probably recognize. The threat of a soldier, probably not. And it's something that that stayed in my head ever since, I guess.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Well, we are at the end, but it would be nice to have some. Oh, Stephen's got his hand up now. So this hard end at 7 o'clock is going to become a soft end. God, that sounds.
I'm just sort of
We'll
reinforcing.
just leave that over there. And Stephen, your question.
Well, I think just reinforcing the points that Mary and Charles have also made, really, that although there's this reciprocity between abundance and need, often generosity is most evident when there are resources. You see it all the time in vernacular architecture. In the Muslim Malay marketplace, it's where you spread out your mat, which becomes your shop, and the negotiation of space there. Or in another paper, Lily Cheese paper, the street shops that just spring up on really quite hard, unforgiving edges, but there's a sort of hybrid grafting onto spaces that aren't very inviting. So generosity doesn't need abundance, but it's nice to have it's nice to have resources as well.
Very, very good. Nigel, you have a question, and I'm feeling generous, so you can answer. You can ask it.
Sorry, I was looking for the chat. I don't have. It's very interesting. I don't have a question.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for the questions and a lovely discussion. I wondered if you, editor trio, had some closing remarks for us. If you had prepared something, or if not, then we can certainly. It would be nice to hear about where next for this concept, both the concept and the book and the program.
Stephen has his hand up.
Stephen has it. I think it's a historical hand.
It's a historical hand.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, nothing prepared my end other than to thank everybody for joining, and to thank Shan and Jane for nudging us into a celebration of the book. And I think that's the next step, is how do we kind of return to some of the conversations now that we've gone through and it's out there in real form. There's so many overlaps, and there's work that we're doing that overlaps with what Jane's doing and with what Sean's doing, and so I think it's finding a way to revisit some of the conversations that started and find other forums to carry those on.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. I'm going to end this because I've been charged with doing so, and I just want to say, as a sort of final comment, I think there's something really interesting about. We touched on scale. We touched, I think, on issues around the spiritual dimension, perhaps the kind of deeper dimensions to human community, which have been somewhat bulldozed in the kind of endless pursuit of stuff, of money and power and honor. And this book, for me certainly, and this whole discourse, is a really exciting moment where there's a genuine energy towards turning towards it. And perhaps the issue around scalability, perhaps is a bit of a red herring from me, because hearing what you've said and looking at the papers and watching your presentations, it strikes me that when we think about scalability, when we think about scale, we think about big things, but what we should be thinking about is the scale of lots of small things. Because if all of these projects join together, if all of this kind of work that's going on, that's been exposed and discussed in the book and in the conference and joined together, that's a big scale thing. So scaling up perhaps is not the right way of thinking about it, but making connections. Going back to what Charles was talking about, building these relational networks so that we can develop a kind of sensual connectivity to support a more sustainable, more just, more empathetic, more loaded, more exciting contemporary. Anyway, thank you ever so much, everybody. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Stevens. Thank you, Sean. Thank you for everybody who asked lovely questions. It's been great.
Thanks, Ambrose, for sharing.
Thank you. Thanks, Ambrose. Thanks, everyone.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you, Matthew, as well, of course, for all of the hard work. Cheers. All right.
Good night, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Really nice to see you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.